I think, is the mic on? The question might be, at what point in the development of science does religion inform science? If you consider, for example, Friedrich Nietzsche's early book on the birth of tragedy through the spirit of music, his argument there is that the cosmology of the Greeks was essentially completely incoherent. And that the Greeks believed that the cosmos was at some fundamental level an incoherent order. In that sense, a disorder. And that claim at the time he wrote it was widely panned as just goofy. The Germans couldn't buy that. And it turns out that when I ask my classicist friends about this now, they say most of them believe that Nietzsche had it right. And so one argument that apologists for the Christian faith, for example, have made in the last century or so is that you cannot conceive of the Enlightenment as a tradition, for example, emerging out of a tradition that believes that essentially the cosmos is a chaos and there's some fundamental disorder at the root of all things, but that instead you really have to have a prior commitment or a prior belief or a prior worldview or a prior way of seeing things in which in fact there is a kind of an orderliness to it that we can discern. And so the argument there would be that in at least the faith traditions that we've talked about most today, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, that those faith traditions begin with a claim about the orderliness of the creation, and that it is only out of an acceptance of that kind of a cosmos or universe that even beginning with scientific investigation makes any sense at all. And so you have an old tradition of Christian apologists right up into the modern era who argue that modern science begins not with an anti-religious claim, but rather begins with the acceptance of certain religious arguments or religious ways of seeing things in which the universe, or before that the cosmos, is an orderly place, and therefore it makes sense to investigate that order, and it makes sense to ask questions about it out of reason rather than just sort of out of sort of narcotically induced dreams of some deputy from the gods at Delphi or wherever these oracles hung out. And so that would be one answer, I think, to your question, that science begins with a priori belief that there is in fact an orderly universe or an ordered cosmos which is there to be investigated. If one doesn't accept that, why would one bother? Oh, sure.
It's a good question. As I mentioned in my little talk, that 90% of the Quranic text are the moral teachings, the doing good and refraining the bad. But there are also indications that because human beings are very curious, right? Yeah, we are just coming here becoming the moral person, but we are curious how the sun is rising, how the babies are being born. For example, in an early embryology, that Quran says that there are stages, for example, exactly fits the the trimesters that the modern embryology pretty much laid out, but in a different languages. For example, the zygote in a Quranic language says that it stays in a 40 days in a liquid form. Then after 40 days, it becomes a cloth, and then now the embryo is just growing. And then after the next 40 days, that the hands are appearing. But 1500 years ago, the Arabic Bedouins cannot really understand what the zygote is really. Knowledge is not there yet, so they have to. Quran should use the language that the 1500 years ago Arab Bedouins they can understand. The same thing, for example, for the orbits that mentioning about the, for example, moon stages, that how it becomes a full moon and then changes and then changes. And for example, crescent or the new moon or crescent, that what we identify in modern astronomy, says that it will turn a dried, bended palm tree branches. That's what the Arab Bedouins can understand really. And then also Allah or God Almighty mentioned that there is no any disease that I created without the creation of the treatment. So which means that what we have, the AIDS, that we can cure Alzheimer's, we can cure ALS, we can cure. Yes, we will. It's a matter of time. It's just giving the encouragement. It's just giving the encouragement. But it doesn't really give us a kind of theorems and then formulas or what the Newton discovered and this and that is us that we will do it. It just gives us a kind of really encouragement. Seek the knowledge. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
I think you've done a fine job with resolving whatever conflicts there might be between religion and science. But I guess I came to find out now that you can do that. What are you doing for humanity? Why is there so much strife between all of the religions and has been in history for so many years that it almost makes you feel that religion is the root of all evils rather than that it is a source of enlightenment? The Catholics and the Protestants, the Jews and the Muslims, the Hindus and the Muslims, the Shiites and the Sunnis. Why is it that religion is causing us so much grief in the world? Thank you.
I think I'll just start with my, of course, a very good question. And again, from the perspective of the study of religions, this is what we do is look at why religions take the form that they do over time and why they change in the way they do. And one of the things that's true about all religions is how diverse they are. And we've all sort of solved it up here from a Jewish and Christian and Muslim perspective. But we're not speaking for all representatives of those traditions. And so throughout history, there are always people who are going to reject this sort of listening, this sort of openness, this sort of integrating different sources of knowledge, as I put it. And so, and so that's the reason why we still have these conflicts, is that there are people that there will be people that are more secure with the tradition or with their interpretation of tradition in a way that isn't open, that isn't open to the other, whether that's another person of another faith or another type of knowledge. And I don't have the solution for that.
Now, what are you going to do about it?
And as I see it, talking about the history of religions and that all religions are diverse and that all religions change, and so religions shouldn't be afraid of change. Members of traditions shouldn't be afraid of change, because whether they know it or not, they're participating in it. To me, that's the approach I try to take as a professor of religious studies, and all of us in our own ways probably have our own takes on that. So I want other people to respond to this, but I wanted to start by just saying that we're one representative, one set of voices, but there will always be the other voices too, I think, unfortunately.
I think, let's continue on that question. I think my feeling is that, to be blunt, that question has always been, if not unfair, at least very one-sided historically. It's certainly the case that religious belief has motivated extraordinary amounts of violence. It's also the case that religious belief has motivated extraordinary civilizational achievements. Religious belief has motivated extraordinary scientific achievement. Read what the scientists who discover many of the things that we find to be positive discoveries that help human life said about how their faith motivations inform their scientific investigations. Reverend Hinshaw talked about the establishment of Yale and Harvard and other schools as originally basically schools for preachers. But out of those motivations developed, whatever you may think of the jokes about a Harvard man and all that kind of thing, the fact of the matter is that many of the most important educational institutions, not only in this country but in many other places, were developed by people of faith who saw the development of those institutions, the building of those institutions, as imperatives to improve human life, to investigate the world, etc., that arose from their religious motivations. In the modern world, again, it's certainly the case that Christians have been wonderfully effective at killing one another, at killing non-Christians. There's no doubt about that. It's also the case, though, that Christians have been extraordinarily effective at beginning movements for peace, at establishing all kinds of diplomatic initiatives that bring about peace in the world. So my bottom line on that from the empirical evidence is that, as a matter of fact, the returns are very mixed. But that we have to look at both sides of that. And the other thing I would say as a social scientist is we'd also have to look very carefully at what points is it our religious beliefs that motivate us to violence, that motivate us to exploitation, and at what point is it that our religious beliefs are sort of the palimpsest on top of other kinds of motivations, other kinds of desires, for which we then find convenient excuses in God's will or elsewhere. All of that has to be untangled before we come to the Enlightenment conclusion that, in fact, religion is the sort of beginning of all evil.
I would simply say that what we should do, or what are we doing? We're doing this, and by sitting down talking with one another, we put a human face on people that have different kinds of ideas. We may not always agree, but a human face is always a face we can relate to. And my Christian faith underscores and undergirds that belief on my part.
Yeah, I would add to that when I work as a scholar, I teach my students to be thoughtful, to be respectful, to look at more than one side of an issue. When I am with my Christian brothers and sisters and friends, I try to teach them the same. That's the one small thing that I can do as a scholar and as someone with some education. That's all I can do.
I would just add a few words. I would say that I think the main problem is that we have so much emotion. For example, and when the Danish caricaturist, drew the caricature of the Prophet of Muhammad, I don't know how many hundreds of people were killed in Pakistan. I mean, I was just asking this question by myself. Instead of the killing the 400 or 500 people, how many I don't know exactly, but the several hundred people, probably they will just sit down and make a kind of civil protest or something like that, or get your prime minister and send a kind of protesting letter that we are really unhappy about that, especially this era that we need the peace more than the fight. That's really damaging. But instead, we were just a testosterone driven, and then go out and then they killed one another. So what happened? So now, see, they are fanatics, that they can't accept it. So we can't really accept one thing. The other thing is that the position of the human being. We are just looking at each other, the kind of the consumer point of view. But Islam, through Islam, puts the human being in the center of the universe. It says that the human being is a fine art of God Almighty. Okay, all His attribution is a reflecting on the human being. You may not know, you may not notice, but the sum of the attribution of the God is just reflecting. For example, if you are so charitable person, and then spending almost all your the wealth and the good things, maybe the mercy of God was just the reflecting. See, I mean, we don't see that one, that the human, okay, it's another the competitors, I have to get his wealth and then his whatever the belongings, and then I put the religious doctrine in to strengthen my justification. So now the killings and hatred and this and that. I think the solution is just starting from home, from my household, from my neighborhood, meetings like this, and if we provide a kind of fertile and tolerable platform, I think that it takes time. Blow up this building takes a second. Well, it takes maybe several years and $multi-million of money to build up this amphitheater, right? I think we have to be patient and then to really dig the well with the needle, so to speak. Yes, sir.
When I was a graduate student at Harvard, I used to walk through the yard, and over the arch of one of them is the motto originally, Pro Christo et Ecclesiae, and I never forgot that. Later on, I began reading some of the works of Cardinal Newman, who in the early time of his Anglican career gave a sermon called The Philosophical, which means scientific temperament, first enjoined in the gospel. And he made the argument that up to the time of modern science, there was a lot of speculation